This is Basement Comics, and in the next 8 days, we're going to be talking about all 21 MCU movies in an attempt to count down to the release of Marvel's Endgame. So stay tuned and enjoy. What's up, everyone, and welcome to a special installment of Basement Comics. I'm Blake, and I'll be your host. Today, we'll be talking about the movie that started it all, plus the 2 sequels to follow. This is going to be a mashup podcast of all 3 individual movies into one episode just because of the fact that this is being started 8 days out from Endgame. I know I'm a little late. There is 21 movies, 22 including Endgame, and it probably would have been smarter to start this a while back. But I've been a little busy with work and other things, so we're getting it started now. As I said, it's going to be all 3 movies in this. There might be a couple of my buddies coming on in the near future, depending on if they're free or not. We'll see about that. But I'm going to be doing the top 5 of my favorite scenes from these movies, and just some of the subtle hints and my thoughts of these movies and whatnot. So let's just jump straight into it. So right off the bat, we have just straight action. The typical Marvel intro. Tony is inside of a Humvee, him and 3 other soldiers, and they're driving, as we see later on after his flashback, or the flashback of 36 hours ago. He's obviously driving back to base from the presentation of the Jericho missile, and they get attacked, and he gets captured, and we see later on why this is. There's going to be a spoiler alert if nobody's seen Iron Man, which if you haven't, you guys need to catch up. And but he gets captured, gets taken in, and as we learn later, this is the 10 rings that captures him. I kind of wish that the 10 rings would have been more of a presence in these movies. They are the 10 rings and the Mandalorian in the comics are actually a pretty big piece of Iron Man. But in this movie, the 10 rings is just a terrorist group, kind of like ISIS or any of those things. And he gets captured by them, and I'll reveal why later they capture him and what was supposed to happen, but that's going to come up here in just a second. So he's in the cave, all that's going down, and then we see that he's being operated on to get his new heart, quote unquote, because of the shrapnel from the bomb that lands in front of him that, as he sees, has his name on it. So he learns that his company is dealing under the table, which he's obviously not happy about this later on. Yada yada. We'll get into that in a little bit. But we go to the flashback 36 hours earlier. He's in Vegas, supposed to be getting an award. This is a key scene for me because it has a moment where they're showing pictures of Tony and his achievements and everything, and there's a Rolling Stone magazine cover, and he's on it, obviously. But he's doing like this weird position or pose, and it looks like he's posing with his repulsor rays. So for me, it's just kind of one of those subtle hints that it's kind of like a flash forward. I'm blanking on what the word is right now, but it's kind of a hint towards the future in the movie that he's going to become Iron Man at some point. And so we flash forward from that, and him and Rhodey are going through this whole back and forth thing. Rhodey's kind of like his parent, and he's always having to take care of him and bring him back to reality and whatnot. And then we keep going forward. We get to the scene where Tony is finally showcasing the Jericho missile. Iconic scene for me. This is a really good scene just because it shows him in his element, salesperson. He's making a great speech. Everybody's obviously super into it. Shoots off the Jericho missile, and it goes off with a bang, pun intended, and makes a great presentation. And then he makes the joke that he'll throw in one of those scotch coolers with every purchase of 500 million or more. Um, Gets in the Humvee, calls it the Fun V, and then tells Rhodey that his humdrum V is back behind, and then they head off, and then boom, explosion happens. He gets captured, yada yada. And then we go fast forward from that to present time instead of the 36 hours earlier, and he is in the cave after being operated on, and he has no idea where he is. He's disoriented, um, just contemplating on what happened, almost like a horrible hangover is what his face looks like, and we've all been there. We've all had those mornings. But he leans over and notices there's a guy in there shaving. That's Jensen. We find that out later on. He's the doctor that saved him. And we see in, spoiler alert coming up, not right now, but we see in another movie that they actually have a deeper connection. They say it in here that he's met him before, but we've never seen it in a movie until later on. But he leans over to try and grab something off the table after he knocks his water off, and he realizes that there's something hooked up to him. And Jensen tells him, I wouldn't do that if I were you. He's hooked up to a car battery. Obviously, the car battery has to be charging this arc reactor in his chest so that the shrapnel stays away from his heart. And this is this whole scene for me when Tony wakes up in the cave is another iconic scene for me, just because of the fact that Tony, probably his whole entire life, just because of the fact of how he was raised, where he came from, and the fact that he's a genius, probably the smartest man who's ever lived, and for him to have been brought down to such a level that makes him realize that he really isn't as untouchable as he thinks he is, and that he isn't as invincible as he thinks he is. And now he's been brought from Tony Stark, philanthropist, billionaire, playboy, that he's been brought down from this iconic level to nobody. He's in a cave. He's captured. He's could have been killed, and he now realizes that this can happen to me. And this is just a really iconic scene for me because it humbles him almost to the point of he realizes he needs to change, and he needs to become a different, I'm not going to say different man, but he needs to change his outlook on life. He needs to change the way he's doing things. And then you fast forward a little bit, skipping past the whole scene. They want him to make the Jericho missile, which is, in my opinion, was kind of stupid, because if they're dealing under the table and they're already buying weapons from the Stark Industries, why would they need Tony Stark to make them a Jericho missile when they could have just got it off the black market from Stark Industries? But we find out later on why that was, and the reason why they wanted him to make one, because they couldn't get their hands on one of their own. But fast forwarding, we get to the scene of the escape, and he's getting the Mark I activated. But before this, we're going to go back. There's to me, a really, really iconic scene, probably in this whole spat of scenes in the very beginning of the movie where he's in the cave with Jensen. This is probably the most iconic scene. This would be my number one scene of my favorite scenes and key scenes, in my opinion, is when Jensen says that Tony asks him if he has a family, and Jensen says yes, he does, and he's going to see them again. And we learn later on, spoiler alert, this will spoil it. This is going to be one right now. So if you haven't seen Iron Man, like I said before, you need to catch up, but cover your ears. Jensen tells him he's going to see his family again. And we learn later on that this moment was kind of a foreshadow for the fact that he really knew that he probably wasn't going to make it out of this cave alive. He didn't think that either one of them would make it out alive. Obviously, if Tony makes the Jericho missile, then Tony and Jensen have no more leverage over the terrorists, and they would just probably kill them. And Jensen obviously realized that, and so he tells him, he's going to see his family again, and as we learn later on, his family is dead, and he is on his way to see them. So this is a key scene for me because he knew that they weren't going to make it out of this cave, and whether or not he was going to get Tony out of there or they both weren't going to make it. I mean, he was just making the best out of it. This is also the scene where he tells Tony, or Tony tells him it's going to take about a week to make the Jericho missile, and they're probably going to kill him right after. And he tells him, well, sounds like you got a very important week, don't you? And Tony realizes, as soon as Jensen says this, Tony realizes, I got to do something. We got to get out of here. And so, obviously, that's when the gears start turning for him to make a Iron Man suit. I'm going to get into what I think about this scene, or not this scene, but kind of that moment when he tells him you've got a very important week. For me, there's something to it about Tony that it's kind of key for Tony, in my opinion, kind of a key thing. So we'll get into that here in just a little bit. Moving forward, Tony gets out. He goes through the cave with the Mark 1. Everything works decently all right, I guess, if you want to call it all right. I mean, it is obviously the first trial. He built this freaking thing in a cave. I have a couple friends who can't even make a pizza without burning the cardboard underneath because they didn't realize you were supposed to take that out. You know who you are if you're listening to this. But he builds this suit of armor, Iron Man prototype 1 that can fly in a cave. And so he gets out. Everything goes fine, but he gets out, flies, and then they get shot down and crashes. And then he's spent, we don't know how long he was walking across the desert, but they obviously were out looking for him. Rhodey finds him, brings him in, tells him, next time you're riding with me instead of the Fun V. He gets back. First thing he wants is a hamburger, or a cheeseburger, excuse me, from Burger King. And he wants to announce a press conference. And so right off the bat, when I first saw the movie in 2008, I had already put that together. I remember seeing this movie, and I remember thinking, as soon as he went to the press conference, I was like, oh, this is it. He's going to go off. He's going to try and find out who is the one dealing under the table with these weapons. And he was going to call the press conference to close down that part of his business. And when he calls the press conference, he gets in there, he makes everybody sit down, just so he can be on the same level as them. He's tired. He's been locked up in a cave for however long. He should have went to the hospital, but of course, Tony being Tony, he wants to get this out to the public. And then, of course, he does. He tells them, I'm shutting down the weapons business. We're getting out of it. I saw some things over there. I saw my weapons in the wrong hands. Those weapons were supposed to be for the people who, from America, and somebody's double dealing. And I don't think that he really, in his state of mind, put two and two together that somebody within the business was double dealing, but it occurred to me, and obviously we get to that scene later on, yada yada. But so he gets home, and after making the Mark 1 suit, obviously you're not just going to not want to expand on this. I mean, that was a great thing. That was his first suit. He had built a suit of armor that could fly and shoot rockets and everything. And then he also realized his weapons were over in these war zones, in the wrong hands. And his first thought was, I've got to stop this. I have to stop this. Now, we're going to stop right here, and this, for me, is a big thing about Tony. In all of these movies, starting from this movie all the way up until, in my opinion, the trailer for Endgame, and as we see in Avengers Ultron, we'll get into that movie later on down the line, but just from that movie, he wants so bad to protect everyone. He, for some reason, and I think it spurts from this. He never really felt any responsibilities. He never really felt the need to be at board meetings or do certain things with his company. Basically, just he created things and then his company sold them. Um, he continued on. His dad made weapons, so he just continued on the business. And uh, I don't really think he ever felt any responsibility or any weight on his shoulders. And then he notices that his weapons are in the wrong hands in Iron Man 1. And from this movie on, I think that spurts his need for wanting to take care of everyone and protect everyone. He now feels this weight on his shoulders. And I think the MCU really did a great job of showing that throughout all of these movies, he never really thought that this would happen to him. And then it did. And he adapted, overcame, and it's never going to happen again. And that is the great thing about Tony, is that he can never fail twice at the same thing. But it's also a curse for him because he feels the need to protect everyone. He feels like he is the responsibility holder. Whenever they join the Avengers team, he feels the need to try and be the leader, and get everybody together and take all the responsibility for himself. And I think it spurts from Iron Man 1. And so he starts making the suit and feels the need to go overseas and get his weapons out of the hands of the bad guys. And so he does. He continues working on his suit. He makes the Mark II, and then gets it all ready, make sure it flies, and we see him in the scene in the garage with his little robot arms, and it's just funny to me. These are like almost like a young kid who makes a science fair project, and they're just hanging around. And I think Marvel does a great job of giving these things a personality. Tony insults them and they get all upset and make these little robot noises to just add that little touch to it. And I just think it was the funniest thing. And then after he gets the suit all put together and everything, he throws his little flare on it. Now we get the suit that's the traditional red and yellow. He's Iron Man. He goes out and does his first mission. He flies in and saves the civilian population of the town of Golmir, I think it's Golmir, because I know that he sees on the news that Golmir was devastated by Stark weapons. Or no, he doesn't see on the news the lady that he did the interview with. That's right. Sorry, I'm a little. I just got done rewatching all the movies and I'm a little discombobulated. But he sees this news of the enemy having all these weapons, and he still has no idea that this is happening under the table. He goes up and confronts Obadiah, who obviously, right off the bat, you realize is warmonger. And if you knew the comics, you immediately hated this guy from the beginning. But they do a really good job of trying to make him seem like the good guy. He's there for Tony. He wants to be there for Tony. But once Tony finally wises up to what's happening and isn't just going to be the front for the company anymore, and he wants to end this, now it's a problem for Obadiah. And Tony confronts him about this. And obviously Obadiah, with the press there, there's witnesses and everything, and he doesn't want to make a big scene, tells Tony he's right, and tells him that he was the one that tried locking Tony out of the company. And finally, Tony realizes that Obadiah is not a good guy. He is obviously a bad guy. And so now Tony puts it on himself, gets his suit on, flies over, saves the town. This right here is number 2 on my list of favorite scenes and key scenes is when he flies in, saves the civilians, and then grabs the one guy, throws him down, and tells him he's all yours. And obviously they're gonna fucking rip that guy apart. Excuse my language. And and then he starts flying off, and this tank shoots him down. Now, this was really cool because to me it shows that his armor is um, is strong enough to withstand a tank uh, around. And he climbs out of the hole. He's got all these cuts and scratches all over his suit, and you can just tell the Iron Man mask obviously never changes shape. It's a metal mask. But when he comes out, you can just see that behind the mask is a guy who is very irritated by that shot. Gets up, stares the tank down, tank shoots, and he dodges it and looks back at the tank like, "You serious?" And then he shoots his little tank buster at him, and then just he turns away and starts walking off. And as soon as the tank blows up, the music cues up and drops, and from that moment you immediately know that this is what he's supposed to do. This is his calling. He is Iron Man. At that moment in my mind, that's when he finally took on the mantle. Great scene. It was a very key scene. And then when he's leaving, he gets in the little spat with the F-22 Raptors, and then Rhodey calls him, asks about if he's got any tech over there, and then obviously he reveals to Rhodey that he's Iron Man. So now Rhodey and Pepper are the only two people who know his secret identity. So you got the cliche best friend and girlfriend. They're not girlfriend boyfriend yet, but obviously there's that tension there. But you've got the cliche girlfriend boyfriend, yada yada. Which at the very end, when they're doing the last press conference, he makes a crack at the fact that if he was a superhero, he would obviously have a girlfriend that knows his secret identity. And he kind of jokes around about him and her getting together. But after this scene, it moves on to the next scene, which we spent the whole movie seeing Obadiah as a nice guy, we think. And then as soon as Tony confronts him, Obadiah reveals that he is the one dealing under the table. And then from then on, we know he's a bad guy. We don't like him because he's a bad guy. And then you get to see his dealings under the table. He goes and meets with the 10 Rings and their leader, who isn't the Mandalorian. It's just a terrorist organization leader. I don't think they said his name in the movie, but the 10 Rings leader is what I'm going to call him. He shows up. Or Obadiah shows up to talk to him because obviously he's recovered the Mark 1 armor and schematics. And so Obadiah now wants this for himself. So he shows up with his squad. They go inside. He uses the paralyzer, takes it from him. And so from then on, we see Obadiah as the person that he really is. We move on from this. And he gets back, and he's hired his best engineers that he could find to try and build this arc reactor in a miniature form just to power the suits. And this is the number 3 scene for me, is when Obadiah tells the scientist that the scientist tells Obadiah, he's like, we can't get it done. Making an arc reactor that small is impossible. And this sets Obadiah off because obviously it is possible, for one. And 2, Tony Stark did it in a cave with a box of scraps. Quote from Obadiah himself. But he screams at him, and the scientist makes a pretty valid point. Tells him that he's sorry, but he's not Tony Stark. And this is a great thing to me because it just shows the genius of Tony Stark and how smart he really is. I mean, he built a freaking mini arc reactor in a cave. And so Obadiah is still trying to do this. So once at this moment, then you realize that he realizes that the only person who could make this technology at this point in time, obviously there's another person who can make this technology, but we won't find out about that until the next movie. If you know, then you know. But he realizes, okay, so Tony's the only one who can make this. So what am I going to do? He says to himself that he's going to go take Tony's straight from his chest. So obviously Obadiah has access to Tony's mansion. This kind of irritated me a little bit because if it was me, as soon as I found out he was dealing under the table and that he was actually a bad guy, I would have immediately locked him out of everything. I would have pushed to get him off the board. I would have definitely not let him have access to my house. But Tony goes home and Obadiah's there. He's trying to call Pepper to get her to not go to make sure she's fine. And then Obadiah's in the house and turns on the partial paralysis little machine. Looks kind of like the Men in Black. Memory deleter. But so he turns that on and then drills it out of his chest and takes Tony's basically his heart from his chest, and he goes and gets it put into his suit, and now his suit's ready to go. And obviously this was kind of a huge jump for me. If these guys couldn't make the arc reactor, they sure did make Obadiah's suit in quite a short amount of time. That was kind of a funny thing to me. But so he gets his suit powered up. Tony, regains his movement. He regains his ability to move. The paralysis wears off, and he starts making his way downstairs. And he's stumbling and falling everywhere because his lifeline is now ripped out of his chest, and he's basically dying slowly. And he gets to the Mark 1 arc reactor and smashes it, puts it in his chest, and then now he's back. Rhodey comes in, finds him, and gets him up. And then this right here was number 4 for me of favorite scenes because it gave a nod to War Machine, and that we obviously were going to see War Machine later on. But it was really cool just because the Mark II armor was all chrome, which I personally like the all chrome look. It was pretty cool. But War Machine's all silver. So as soon as Rhodey turns and looks at it, my heart starts racing in the theater. It races almost every time just because it's an awesome scene. He looks at it, music starts playing. Nope. Next time, baby. But I thought it would have been really cool if he would have suited up, but I do like the anticipation that we're going to see War Machine later on. That was kind of nice to see. So he leaves and heads out, and Tony told him just to clear the skies, so he goes and hangs up the phone so that nobody makes any calls. Just a training exercise, the way he tells his guys. So now Tony's clear to do whatever he needs to do. So he gets there, and then Pepper and S.H.I.E.L.D., which we never hear Agent Coulson call it S.H.I.E.L.D. He just calls it the Strategic Homeland Enforcement Intelligence Logistics Division, I think is what it was. I'm not for sure on that acronym, but he just calls it by its full name, not the acronym name, and obviously it's a huge mouthful. But he never calls it S.H.I.E.L.D., but S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and Pepper show up to arrest Obadiah. They get in, and obviously he's in the suit already and tears through them, and Pepper finally makes it out. The scene where he's he turns his jets on, chases Pepper towards the door, and then gets caught in the door. This scene, after watching the first Avengers and coming back to watch Iron Man, this is kind of a reused scene in my opinion, because this scene looked just like when Black Widow barely got missed by being chased by the Hulk. Um, I just thought it was kind of a cool comparison that they had used this later on. Um, but so she gets out. Tony shows up and saves her before Obadiah blows her to pieces, and so they get to fighting and everything. And this is where my number 5 top scene from this movie. It's probably not a scene that a lot of people like, but for me it is, because as I'll explain later on, probably at the end of movie number 3 when I finally get to that, they start flying, which this doesn't make any sense to me. If you've got Tony, who's got this highly maneuverable suit, to me, highly maneuverable while being fast and powerful is the evolution you want. But you got Obadiah's suit, he claims is more advanced in every way, but it's this giant, bulky suit. And when he takes off to do space flight, or to fly, not space flight, but when he goes to fly, he turns into this spaceship. And he takes so long to build up any thrust that I feel like if Tony were to make any maneuvers, Obadiah wouldn't be able to catch him, because there's no way he can turn, not with that much thrust behind his jets. But they get up into space, and obviously when Tony did his first flight, he had an icing problem. And so when they get up there, this is his way of hopefully defeating Obadiah. And they get up into the atmosphere, and then this is when Obadiah tells them, my suit's more advanced in every way. And then Tony asks him, well, how'd you solve the icing problem? And obviously Tony had solved the icing problem, because like I said before, Tony doesn't fail twice at the same thing. So Tony solved the icing problem. Obadiah has no idea what he's talking about, freezes, system turns off, and he tells him, should probably look into that, and then bops him on the head. And that to me was just an awesome scene, because it was like, he's like, my suit's more advanced in every way, and it's like, oh really? Well, how'd you solve the icing problem? And then he just knocks him on the head and tells him he should probably look into it. And he goes plummeting to Earth. And then Tony's losing power, because obviously his Mark I chess piece wasn't built for sustained flight, as Jarvis told him. So now he's running on like 2% battery power, makes it down to the rooftop on reserve power, and then he has to finish the fight with no power in the suit, which this scene where Tony's fighting with barely any power in the suit, or the suit halfway on, happens in every Iron Man movie and almost every Avengers movie. Avengers number 1, the suit stays on 24/7, but like in Iron Man 1, he fights where his helmet gets taken off, he takes his glove off, he's trying to get out of the suit, he's halfway in the suit, fighting without any power. Iron Man 2, some of the pieces of the suit get ripped off. Iron Man 3, he fights in a whole multitude of different suits. Avengers Infinity War, when he's fighting with the nanotech, obviously Thanos is ripping off pieces, but that's later on. I'm kind of getting sidetracked. So Tony's fighting with half the power in the suit. He gets up to he finally gets to the point to where he needs to tell Pepper, hey, you need to go inside, you need to overpower the arc reactor, and we're going to blow the roof, because that's the only way we're going to beat him. And so he gets him to the point where he needs to be, and Pepper pulls it, boom, kills Obadiah, and he falls into the arc reactor, blows up, and Tony saves the day. This movie was awesome to me, because it was a good storyline, all the way through and through. When they get to the press conference at the end, I really like how it gives those subtle hints to certain things, like him telling her that if he was a superhero and everybody knew about him, that he would have to have a secret identity, which means that only one person would know it, and that'd be my girlfriend. And so he's kind of making a poke at him and Pepper. being boyfriend girlfriend just because of the fact that she's the only one that knows her and Rhodey. Um, and then he's supposed to stick to the cards. And then Tony, obviously being Tony, he can't just not be the center of attention. And this is what I was talking about before, where he's that's Tony from the beginning. He's always got to be the center of attention. He's this partier, always got to be the spotlight kind of guy. And then now is the moment where Iron Man's in the spotlight, but Tony Stark isn't. And so he's got these cue cards. He even tells him he's like, I'm supposed to stick to these cue cards, and then he tells everybody he's Iron Man. And then the movie ends, and it was great. But yeah, I just think it's really cool that he told them that he was Iron Man, because obviously Tony doesn't give a shit. And but a scene that I want to do an honorable mention, if you will. This movie is the first time we see a cameo, and Stan Lee, rest in peace. He makes his first cameo in the movie, and obviously that starts a whole chain of cameos, and he's in every single Marvel movie from then on out. And in this movie, he's Hugh Hefner, which is just awesome. He walks up and says, "Hey, what's up, Hugh?" and pats him on the back, and he turns around. So yeah, that seeing him in the movie was just one of those things where I laughed in the theater just because it was like, what is he doing out here? But yeah, this movie was great. I loved it, and yeah, we're gonna get on and start with the next one. Also, at the end of this movie, it was something that you wouldn't think to stay for. It's never been in any other movies before. If it has, I don't know of any. But I had heard that a buddy of mine that I went with to watch this movie, I guess we had heard that there was something going to be after the credits, which, I mean, I don't know. It was just something we had heard when we got to the theater. But the only reason why I stayed for the credits was because the movie theater was packed and nobody was really leaving yet, because they probably had the same idea, wait till everybody leaves so that, not everybody's just bum rushing the stairs. And as I'm getting up to leave, the screen comes back on and there's a scene, and I sit back down, and this is when you see your first end credits scene for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's Nick Fury basically introducing S.H.I.E.L.D., and the fact that they've been there the whole time. And we see Nick Fury for the first time, and he tells Tony he needs to have a word with him. And, basically that's all that was, said, and the scene ends. And then now it's just like, oh my God, you know what I mean? Like, we're about to see a whole timeline unravel. And I just couldn't have imagined that starting from this movie was going to be just this huge chain of events. I was beyond pumped. I'm still beyond pumped. I rewatch Avengers Endgame trailers every now and then. I know it's a little too much, but hey, I'm a super fan. I've been rewatching all the movies, A, for the podcast, so I can have some information and remember most of the scenes, and B, just because I rewatch these movies anyway, just like a Harry Potter nerd loves Harry Potter, and they can rewatch the movies, reread the books. I can reread the comics and rewatch the movies, and it's always a great thing. Iron Man 3. So with this movie, again, we see right off the bat, we meet the villain again, Aldrich Killian, which you can kind of assume that, just like in Iron Man 2, the person you see right off the bat. So Tony basically in Iron Man 2 created demons with Anton Vanko. I guess Tony didn't really make the demons. His dad did, by what he did to the Vanko family, I guess. But we see Ivan Vanko, and you can kind of assume that that's going to be the villain, just because of, the scene and the feeling with the scene when we see Aldrich Killian, we don't really necessarily know he's going to be the villain. But as Tony is explaining, because in the beginning of this movie, which is different than any of the other ones, Tony is narrating this movie, um, which I think is a key piece of information just because of the fact that him narrating the movie is kind of like he's looking back on it. And as I said for Iron Man 2, in my opinion, Iron Man 2 and Iron Man 3 were him just free falling. His life was just going to crap in both of them, and he just keeps plummeting down and down. Obviously, Iron Man 3 takes place after Avengers in New York, and we see the effects of that event had on him. He's got this PTSD anxiety that he's got from it. He's again doesn't know how to handle it. He's so freaked out by it. Just like he tells Pepper, the invaders come in through this wormhole, and then we fight them, and then they're just gone. And he's doesn't understand. He's so in shock, and as I said, he's just losing himself. And so he's narrating the movie. We see Aldrich Killian. He basically says that I had just created a demon. Boom. Now we've got a villain. Which, just like the last one, he created or didn't create the villain, but the movie created the villain right off the bat, just like the last one. Again, Tony has the anxiety, but his anxiety also has created, as I said in Iron Man 2 and Iron Man 1, he puts on this mantle where he feels he has to protect everyone. He has to protect the whole world. He has to put this safety net around the whole world, which he doesn't say yet, but that's what I'm saying, and that's kind of a clue as into another movie, which also ties into his need to protect everyone, and that he feels like he's the only one who can wear this mantle of protecting the world. And so we start this movie with him, and he's, the effects of New York happened, and he doesn't want to go to sleep, because once he goes to sleep, he starts dreaming about this. So he's up for 72 hours straight right off the bat. He had this flashback of Aldrin on that 1999 New Year right before 2000, and then we come forward, and he's working on another suit. He's implanting these microchips into his arms so that the suit can just come straight to him from wherever he is. And so this scene where he's working down there, and you find out that he's 72 hours with no sleep, is I'm going to put it at number 5, but it's the first scene that's important to me, because it really shows how bad New York messed him up, and how bad New York escalated his need for protecting everyone, because he was the one that carried the nuke out, and that really took a toll on him. And he knows that now he's the only one who made that sacrifice at that moment, and still feels alone in this hero battle. And so he built like 30 or 40 new suits with different powers, and we see them later on in the movie, spoiler alert. And but I just think that he's continuing his free fall down, and we'll see him later on make a change at the very end of the movie. But I think this movie is his rock bottom, and this is, obviously the only place to go is up. The 10 Rings returns. The Mandalorian shows up, and this is the villain we see. So it kind of is a misleading thing. I think that it was going to be Aldrich Killian as the main villain, and then the Mandalorian shows up with the 10 rings, which is awesome for me, because like I said in Iron Man 1, I was hoping that there would be more of the 10 rings, and that the Mandalorian would make a debut. And so he does, and you're like, they do a really good job of showing him um, as a villain. He has the scene where he's showing his second to final lesson to the president, and the president says, "I have to make this call. I can't not save this guy on live TV." So he calls, and the Mandalorian still shoots him anyway. Um, that was my second favorite scene. That's later on in the movie, way later on, but that's my second. That's my number 2 favorite scene. We've already got number 5 and number 2 down, but number 2 was my favorite scene. Number 2, just because of the fact that it shows that that's why we don't deal with terrorists, because they're going to do it anyway. And as we've seen before, when Tony was in the cave with Jensen knew that these people in the 10 rings, they don't deal with anybody. They'll tell you they're going to do something, and they're really honestly not going to do it. And so, as we see here, he said he was going to let the guy go, and he didn't. The you know, we as we're going through this, we see Aldridge again, but he's not a cripple anymore, or at least not, with the handicap problems that he was having, and he explains that he went through a bunch of physical therapies and everything, which, you're like, oh, that's great, that's awesome that he changed like this, and then we find out later that he's the Mandalorian. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen these. I cannot say this enough. Catch up. I shouldn't be having to say spoiler alert, because all of you should have already seen these. But we find out that he is the Mandalorian and that he's the one pulling the strings. He's created this new... basically, he explains to Pepper that he's... And this is my number 3 scene, is when he's explaining to Pepper that our brain is essentially a hard drive or a computer that was meant to be upgraded. Evolution is supposed to happen by what he says. And so he's found a way to, that empty slot in our brains, he has found a way to write code, essentially a DNA code, to fill that spot. And that's what gives him the extremists that he's using. And some people take to it, some people don't. We find out later on that the bombings that are happening from the Mandalorian are indeed people just not handling the extremist solution, or I don't know what you would call it, but people not being able to handle the injections and exploding. So big scene in this movie. I don't know if I'd put it on my top favorites, but it definitely, if it was, it would be number 6, is when Tony finally admits that New York messed him up. He's a wreck. He admits this to Pepper, and he also admits this to the young kid that he runs into that helps him. He tells them both New York just ruined him, and he is so shaken up by it, because it was just an event that happened and then left, and he just doesn't know. Are they going to come back? Are there more? Are they stronger? Are we going to be able to defend them next time? And there's just all these things that are just weighing him down, and that's why he's been making these new robots. Tony, again, with his spiraling downwards. This was probably my number 1 scene, in my opinion, because he makes the threat to the Mandalorian, gives out his home address, and I know this is his final straw, just because the Mandalorian's explosion put Happy into a coma, and Tony and revenge and anger don't really go too well, as we see in Civil War. We'll talk about that later, but Tony, revenge, anger, not a good combination. And so Tony just loses it. Tells him his home address, tells him, come on by, I'll leave the door unlocked. So as if you weren't expecting them to come by. They fly 2 helicopters in, bomb his house, and almost kill him. And then you see him flying out of the water. He leaves, doesn't even tell Pepper that he is leaving. But I'm going to change the order. I'm going to put that at number 2, the scene where he confronts the Mandalorian and threatens him. And my number 1 scene, and this scene connects with, and if you want to, go back and rewatch this scene and then rewatch the Avengers Endgame trailer number 1, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The scene where Tony records the message to Pepper with the remaining power on his suit. He basically tells her, I can't come back until I kill this guy. This is one mission that I have to finish. And the identical thing happened. Tony chases Thanos out into space, and now he's stuck on the Benatar out in space with Nebula, and he records the message to Pepper that he may not come back. And it's the exact same thing, which leads me to think that this scene may be tied in with Endgame, and that when he was recording that message, that it was sent over his private server back to one of his helmets at home. And Pepper's gonna, get the message. And she's going to be the one that helps get him back home. But yeah, that's my number 1 scene for sure. The fight scene in this movie, I don't know. It was kind of corny when Pepper was injected with the extremis and, turns into one of them. I mean, it would have been cooler to see her as Rescue, which in the comics is where she wears the pink Iron Man armor and becomes Rescue. I didn't really like how she turned into a badass at the end of this and basically saved Tony. I mean, I'm not trying to take anything away from anybody or say that she shouldn't be because of any reasons, but it was just kind of corny, in my opinion. I mean, I know we needed that emotional hurt where she falls, Tony thinks she's dead, and then she rises from the ashes. And then, so now she's got this newfound power, and then Tony tells her he's going to not take it away, like, rudely, but he just says, I'll make you better, because she doesn't want this. But, I mean, the fight scene, the part about the fight scene that was cool for me was the fact that we get to see all of his Iron Man suits. And like I was talking about, we get to see the fact that he's been building these suits ever since New York because of his fear, of his inability to cope with the fact that happened. And so he's built all these suits, and then he tells Jarvis to send them all out to fight. And then at the end, we see Pepper basically saying, like, I'm done. This has to stop. The worrying, all this stuff, basically being in a spiral downhill with your life. And so he tells Jarvis, do the clean slate protocol, blows them all up. We see he goes to the hospital and gets the chest piece taken out of his chest just to kind of prove to Pepper that, you're right, I need to change. He changes, and the narration at the end says that he's done. And so Iron Man 3 wasn't that bad of a movie. It was better than Iron Man 2 for sure. The storyline was better. There wasn't as many holes in the plot. The characters weren't all that bad. There was some downs that I didn't like I said, with Pepper getting these powers and becoming this badass at the end, which is awesome. I like the fact that Pepper had more to do with the storyline than usual, but like I said, it would have been better if she would have came in as Rescue or something like that. But I liked that. My favorite scene is that he records this message to Pepper basically saying I may not come back, and that ties in so well with Avengers Endgame. So yeah, there's that's all I've got on Iron Man 1, 2, and 3. I think I'm going to go ahead and call it a night here. Thanks for stopping by if anybody came to listen. Thanks for staying this long if you listened. I'm going to be trying to do a podcast at least every day uploaded. It just depends on if I'm free, if I have work. And like I said, there might be a couple of guys coming on with me to do some better shows where we'll have some more banter back and forth. So like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and stay tuned for more.